We are live.
And H41 is enacting the repeal of the domestic and sexual violence cases. Did we had a
Yeah, I did.
okay, Tim.
So Tim Leaders Dumont, the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, and I'm here on H41 with many colleagues in the room and also on Zoom. Thanks for hearing from the department on this. So first, I wanted to just say this is another example of a bill, not that you shouldn't always do your House and Senate tweaking, but another example of a bill that reflects extensive collaboration between stakeholders, many hours of work, both prior to the session and during this legislative session between the Vermont Network, CCVS, Legislative Council, Attorney General's Office, State's Attorneys, Deputy State's Attorneys, Defender General's Office, and victim advocates. So a lot of that work happened on the House side, and the bill is much different than the bill that was introduced back in January. And from the department's view, we do see the changes that have been consensus in nature to be improvements. And we did, I won't dwell on it because I don't think it's really worth the time this morning, but we did have some initial concerns when it was first introduced. And we see this bill as something that's going to jumpstart an effort that's already been happening. The network has been leading the way on a lot of these conversations about how do we address a community of folks that when I was dealing with hundreds of cases in Washington County, everyone's going to come back into the community for the most part in the domestic violence realm. And so how do we better address kind of two categories? First of all, folks that aren't reaching out to law enforcement. I think that's really the aim of H41, that gap of victims who might have criminal exposure themselves and are maybe hesitant to reach out to law enforcement, but also even for the folks that maybe aren't involved in the criminal justice system, this bill is a bit open architecture in that if someone did have a criminal pending case, and responding to one of your questions that you asked last time, Senator Sheen, this bill would allow for an MOU to be set up so that someone has a case going through the system that could also engage in some restorative practices as well. So we think it's flexible. We really deeply appreciate all the work that's gone in, and my colleague Attorney Jacobson and her shop taking on some of the role of a state entity kind of owning some aspect of this. We did see that was an important edit and amendment to the original version. And so we really appreciate the Community Justice Division stepping up and doing that. We appreciate the reporting requirements. We do think just because it is a change in practice, albeit one that is, I think, gaining some steam, we do see the reporting requirement. It's just helpful so we can know kind of where we're going, where we're headed. Prosecutorial involvement in certain situations is another aspect of the bill, along with law enforcement in certain situations. I think that's good practice in part because prosecutors handling 99% of cases like this in Vermont are embedded in the local community. So they might have a really good sense, even if they're doing a restorative pathway for how to address something. And there's some really important language about exemptions to confidentiality. And that was a robust conversation, in part reflecting some Uniform Mediation Act type language that allows for, once certain language is said about whether it's child abuse or violence threats of that nature, that confidentiality falls away for the purposes of making sure that something is still safe. So we really appreciated all that work. And I think moving forward, we're happy to be at the table talking about this. And I will say it inspired a lot of conversation in our department, which is expected whenever there's a change in practice. So that's really it from us. We appreciate this and look forward to seeing where it's headed, and want to see that it's done well. And we do think that we're optimistic about that.
Does the geographic disparities concern you?
So whenever it does slightly, not because I don't think that it's not something that we can work through. I think for this to be successful, as Sarah Robinson and the network have really testified to at length, it has to involve that local buy-in and engagement. And so geographic differences can also be a strength with respect to something like this. So a local community might really rally around something like this and have a great volunteer base. There's great CJC right here in Montpelier and in Barrie with good volunteers. And also geographic regions might have different sensitivities. If there's been a real an uptick, for example, in Bennington with some particular type of situation, maybe you build your MOU a little differently. So I do think the geographic differences, to the extent that they might also be strengths in certain situations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I meant thank
Oh, sorry.
Senator.
Thank you as well, Senator.
Thank you. I want to ask this delicately as possible, but my only concern is that frequently domestic violence cases and sexual violence cases involve repeat offenders, and it only takes one case where, for example, following a diversion, another occurs, and the woman is, I'm going to use woman in this case, but it could be a man, is severely beaten or murdered. And people will wonder, well, why did the state's attorney or the community justice center accept this particular person? And that's my biggest concern. You feel that the guidelines are strong enough?
I think that there's some robust language in here, and I do have a lot of faith, just the way that the Community Justice Division has handled the diversion program over the years. It's a new area, and it is an area that, as we've heard since even this session, does have a higher correlation with violence, as you said. I think I have a lot of optimism that we have the right people working on it, if that makes sense. But one of the things that we'd want to build into MOUs that the state's attorneys are a party to is making sure that individuals who are in the repeat fashion, or who might be highly likely to be in a repeat fashion, because as we know, it's not, people don't call in the first instance of a domestic violence case. So I think that's a major conversation discussion point, that the group that is setting up the MOUs and the guidelines, that's got to be one of the most important questions that they address about safety. And I hope, I really do think that, with the AG's office involvement, who've been tracking the domestic violence fatality work, I think that we do have the right people working on it. One thing that our victim advocates brought up in the first instance when the bill was introduced was that there might be differences that aren't being caught, maybe in this part of the state, they're doing referrals this way and that way. And the fact that the AG's office and also the network being a statewide entity is going to be kind of playing an oversight role. Hopefully before anyone ever accepts a referral, questions like that, there's a process in place about how to mitigate risk. But I think state's attorneys are having talked, we talked with victims and all that. We have those concerns. We didn't want to stand in the way of this rolling out for that reason alone. But
I understand that I live in an area where there's frequent mobility between North Adams, Mass, Hoosick Falls, New York, and other areas in New York and surrounding communities, particularly Pownell. And we see a lot of our community violence as people who are, for lack of a better term, it gets difficult for folks, so they move to another state. It's not necessarily that they're looking for, they're just getting away from law enforcement and other issues. And I see that so frequently. So it takes good communication with network programs as well as the state's attorney and law enforcement with those surrounding areas.
Yeah, and one of the major questions about making sure this is successful is what does, from my view, personal view, having seen some cases where even after a 20-year relationship, the first instance of domestic violence that's coming into court, how many times did it happen before? And so the major question is, how do we make sure that we're really getting at what voluntariness looks like in this context? But the nice thing is, it's a requirement that it's voluntary for the victim in terms of the added protection. The next step will be, what does that actually look like? How does that get vetted? And I do think that, the network has some expertise in this area that I think will be really helpful in addressing that.
I'm, pro reform and pro alternatives to incarceration and alternatives to others. And I like diversion to give people second chances. I'm just concerned about these two categories. Particularly domestic violence is probably Vermont's biggest criminal justice problem. Without a doubt. And I think I've said enough, but
one thing I wanted to, sorry.
So I'm relatively cautious about this stuff.
One thing I wanted to add is that one of the ways that we talked about this maybe taking place is if someone does have a criminal prosecution ongoing, that the sidecar to the motorcycle, the reparative process might happen alongside. And in Windsor County, it is a post-conviction process. In Windsor County, they have a reparative process, but it's after a conviction, and DOC is involved, as Eric knows. So that's a process that
would make me more comfortable, if, at least if the charge was still available,
So that's
again, the practice concern is, it's not somebody knocking my mailbox down. It's not somebody breaking into my car because I left it open, or busting the windows to buy drugs.
Well, thank you.
Are there other questions? I've kind of dominated the questions.
Thank you.
Our next witness is Aaron Jacobson. Aaron, good morning.
Good morning, Chair Sears. Good morning, Senators. I apologize I could not be there in person today.
Well,
Thanks for letting me zoom in.
I like both alternatives.
Yes. So for the record, Aaron Jacobson from the Attorney General's office. I am an Assistant Attorney General, and I work in our office's Community Justice Unit. The Attorney General supports H41 because we feel it represents an important step forward in how we respond to intimate partner violence in Vermont. And that is not by replacing any current system, but by supplementing what is currently available to survivors in the traditional criminal justice process. H41 creates the possibility for victim-centered, data-driven, restorative justice approaches for DV and SV cases. As you heard from Sarah Robinson from the network a couple of weeks ago, H41 flows directly from the work of the Act 146 Study Committee of 2018, which was charged with examining the potential for using restorative justice approaches for DV, SV, and stalking, and which then recommended what this bill does, which is to repeal the prohibition on the referral of DV and SV cases to community justice centers. So H41 does not mandate that any particular case go to a CJC. It just creates the possibility for CJCs to build out that kind of programming, and with a lot of parameters and a lot of stakeholders working together at the table. The study committee's report included findings based not only on scholarship and theory, but also from surveys and focus groups that included feedback from 166 survivors of intimate partner violence and their feelings about what they needed to find justice. And so the path to H41 began with centering survivors. Testimony on this very bill has included voices of survivors, including my own. And you've heard statistics like how last year the network provided support to 8,000 Vermonters, while only 400 of those resulted in prosecutions. Likewise, we know from national statistics that the majority of survivors of intimate partner violence do not report. This is for many reasons, but the fact that there is such a wide gap tells us that we have work to do to address the harm that so many are facing and to find ways to help survivors find safety and the people who've used harm to take accountability. And so in centering survivors, H41 mandates that victim safety, voluntariness, and confidentiality are all key requirements of any restorative justice process that a CJC might provide. Another really important aspect of H41 is that it requires ongoing training. As Rachel Jolly testified, H41 does not seek to allow CJCs to simply add DV and SV cases to existing models. Rather, a CJC will only be able to offer such programming if several criteria are met that are laid out in the bill. One of those criteria is that CJCs must include initial and annual training for their staff, facilitators, and volunteers. And those trainings also involve the very knowledgeable help from the network's members. So it's actually pertaining to training that I do have one amendment request, and that is to add relevant law enforcement and prosecutors to the list of folks for whom training is required. And so for reference, this would be involving subsection C, beginning on page 3, that lists all of the protocols for the memorandums of understanding that must be in place before a CJC can accept referrals. And it's subsection C4 on page 4 that talks about training. And just, I'm looking at the version of the bill that passed the House. So at subsection C4, I would just add to that list relevant law enforcement and prosecutors so that it would say, require initial and annual training for relevant community justice center staff, facilitators, and volunteers, and for relevant law enforcement and prosecutors on the dynamics involving domestic violence and sexual violence, trauma-informed approaches, and restorative justice principles. And my proposed amendment is not to suggest in any way that law enforcement and prosecutors are ignorant about working with survivors or using trauma-informed approaches. On the contrary, but the required training also involves learning about restorative justice approaches for these kinds of cases, which all stakeholders have acknowledged is an evolving field. And so I just feel that all involved would benefit from the shared trainings and from formalized, regularly scheduled opportunities to learn, collaborate, and improve upon best practices. With that, I would really just reiterate what Attorney Lueders-Dumont said, and that is that this bill really reflects a shared, collaborative, constructive process. And it's the work product of many stakeholders and lawmakers that I won't repeat, that Tim already mentioned, in addition to survivors. And so in part because of the process itself that led us to where we are now, I'm really optimistic and excited about the opportunities this bill provides. And I look forward to working with the CJCs and the network and any interested law enforcement to help our communities meet the needs of survivors and hopefully to be able to offer survivors an additional path to safety and justice. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
I just have a quick question, Aaron. When it comes to law enforcement participating in restorative justice, do you see that happening often after a case is investigated and then sent to the state's attorney's office? Or, I mean, how do you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's anticipated that if a community justice center met all of the protocols in H41 and the kind of program they wanted to provide involved direct referrals from law enforcement, then they could.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Any other questions for Aaron? Thank you so much. Appreciate it. We're
You're
gonna
very
get
welcome.
copies of the report for the committee. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you get the amendment?
Yes.
All right, next up is Derek, and I never pronounced his name correctly, but I'm gonna try. Nito Wink.
That's a valiant effort. And
Should just
trying
say
is so
Derek.
important.
Derek,
For
welcome.
the record, Derek Neo-Dovnik. Community and Restorative Justice Executive with the Vermont Department of Corrections. And yeah, the last name doesn't even have a V in it, so it really takes the trigger to work on. So thank you for the opportunity and for the robust conversation that began in the House and has made its way in the form of H41 and all the foundational work that Attorney Jacobson and others have referenced that has iterated to the current version of H41 for your committee. And I would just like to make a couple hopefully brief and connected comments. The first of which is that the concerns that you did articulate, Senator Sears, about the potential severity of risk associated with this, those are certainly ones that I know resonate among all these agencies. That's something that is top of mind, I think, for everyone who's been connected to this work, and certainly reflects the concerns of the Department of Corrections as well. That being said, and underscoring that those concerns, I think, do resonate within the Department of Corrections, and resonate in multiple ways, insofar as we both have supervisory responsibilities to discharge, and then we have administrative responsibilities in connection with the community justice centers, which is really the scope of work that I'm responsible for. But those concerns are constantly and vigilantly being addressed in the spirit of providing choice and providing opportunity and listening to the needs of survivors, and wanting to by no means diminish those risks, but also turn a corner in the response to really a community health epidemic, domestic violence, in a way that gives more voice and choice. And so the Department of Corrections stands with that and recognizes that this provides opportunities and supports that. Couple points I just want to share, and many of these tend to be reflective of some of my purview, which again is that I'm responsible for the administration of the funding that the Department of Corrections receives, and in turn grants out for the specific scopes of work defined in the grants that we have with the entities referred to as community justice centers. And that scope of work is articulated over, of course, set particular programs. And I think the phrase that I really appreciated Attorney Leader Dumont mentioning about this is that this bill creates an open architecture. I hope I got that right. In that it permits referrals to come in through multiple sequential intercepts. And a lot of the foundational language before you in Title 24, Chapter 58, is of a time and of a moment when the Department of Corrections made grants available originally exclusively through municipalities for a defined scope of work that the nomenclature, the title of Community Justice Center was ascribed to. And so you'll see reflected throughout this. And I think that there's general consensus among the institutions that at another point in time, not here, not now, so many things have evolved and progressed that the broader vehicle of Title 24, Chapter 58, probably due for some updating consistent with how restorative justice administratively and institutionally and on a practice level has evolved. But one of the points I just want to make here is that that the Department of Corrections relationship, again, with the agencies that are referred to as community justice centers is articulated in the grants that we have, and those grants have a defined scope of work. And I'm excited about this bill in large part because it's inviting in other agencies into that space. Again, the predominant orientation of CJCs as codified anchors them institutionally in funding from the Agency of Human Services / Department of Corrections. And I think not only on the individual level is this bill creating options for survivors, it's actually creating options for community justice centers to be in active partnership with the Attorney General's office and with the center. And I see that as a positive step. I also want to flag one or two implications of that. And I imagine that these perhaps more granular implications will in fact be the purview of the MOUs that will be developed. So I'm not here to advocate for any specific language change, but just to surface a couple of things. So again, Title 24, Chapter 58 talks about funding from the Agency of Human Services. It reflects in the Section 1, subsection C, funding from the Agency of Human Services. The Agency of Human Services may provide funding and authorize community justice centers to participate in the implementation of state programs related to juvenile and criminal offenses. And indeed, that's a big part of my role through DOC is the administration of those state funds. It goes on in subsection, I think that's a 1 now, it's time for the glasses. I'm sorry, subsection E, section 1, under liability, to say for the purposes of defining liability, community justice center volunteers, and Attorney Leaders Dumont reference the great volunteers we have just down the street here, participating in programs funded by the Agency of Human Services pursuant to section C of this section shall be considered volunteers of that agency. And I interpret that to refer back to the Agency of Human Services. So again, I imagine this will all be captured in the MOUs, especially since it's the Attorney General's office that's providing that valued support. But the point here is just that insofar as these programs may be stood up through resourcing from other sources beyond or separate from the Agency of Human Services, that also, in my interpretation at least, creates a different relationship between the activities of those volunteers and the extension of, say, liability protection back to the Agency of Human Services. I think there's a recognition that these programs need funding and that they need the support. And again, I just want to offer that up as a point of awareness, not looking for any changes. But the notion of a community justice center as an entire organization, as opposed to the specific programs that they perform on state funding, is one that's very much being discussed through multiple expressions, both the statute and practice. I would reference S14 as another piece of legislation that's moving forward that calls into focus this somewhat complex set of inputs and outputs. I think really the only other slight thing I did want to draw some attention to is on page 5 of 7, subsection C, as I read it, once a memorandum of understanding has been verified for compliance by the Community Justice Unit and has been executed by the parties.
You mean subsection E?
I'm sorry, thank you. Even with the glasses, I'm still not managing. Thank you very much, Senator. Yes, you're absolutely right. That's an E, not a C. So once a memorandum of understanding has been verified for compliance by the Community Justice Unit and has been executed by the parties, community justice centers may accept referrals. I imagine the intent of that language is to refer back to the specific community justice center that would have been verified as to being in compliance with the MOU. So that's just the language that I think then universalizes the acceptance of referrals when I believe it's intended to specify, but I certainly defer to others who did the language drafting on that. But I guess in closing, for me within my role, I see this as an important step forward in the intent of the state to advance restorative practices and approaches. I think evolutionary processes bring us into to concerns and into contact with new possibilities that both bring progress and possible unknowns, and that can be uncomfortable. But there's so much responsible stewardship connected to this, and the broader questions that this frames around this. What is a community justice center? What are the funded programs? How do those tether and tie back to the sources of funding and the lines of accountability, both to the public and so on? I think is going to be an ongoing conversation, and by no means do I mention that to want to pump the brakes on this, but rather to encourage as much administrative congruence between pieces of legislation that are moving forward through this body as they relate to restorative justice and what we refer to as community justice centers. Because I'm trying in my own way to steward the dollars that DOC is very honored and privileged to administer to support this broader paradigm, and then specifically to be accountable to the programmatic expressions of that as they relate to our grants. Hope that makes sense. Happy to take any questions.
None, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
Our final witness for this morning is Captain Lance Burton, Vermont State Police Captain.
Good morning.
I must say, I saw an awful lot of police cars, state police cars on their road to Shepsburg this morning.
I have no doubt about that. They're going to Shasper or they're going to Brattleboro this morning. So it's the southern part of the state is very busy. Yeah.
I was just, it seemed like I didn't know there were that many. 107.
Every now and then we come out, so it's good. So
Well, it slowed traffic down, I can tell you that.
Well,
in front of me. People
Well,
putting on their brakes.
on my way here, I saw two marked units.
It's always interesting to watch people's reaction when they see that the state police car is coming down opposite them.
Yeah. So thank you very much. For the record, my name is Captain Lance Burnham with the State Police. I'm also the chair of the State Police Domestic Violence Task Force. I want to acknowledge the amount of work that went into this bill by all the committees that Tim had noted previously. This bill is much different than the bill that I actually testified in the House, which I did not support. And a lot of that was based on the confidentiality that had not been written at the time. And the other reality that we didn't necessarily agree with was the lack of law enforcement involvement at the time. I do believe that the amount of work that has gone into this has changed my opinion in that. I think the Vermont State Police is going to kind of take a soft, neutral position in this bill. But I also think that it's worthy to express our concerns that are actually out there that still remain within this bill. And a lot of that is really based on victim safety. Through my work and through the work through the network and through other state troopers that I work with, we know that domestic violence is a leading cause in homicides in the state of Vermont. We are actively investigating a homicide right now that is directly related to domestic assault. Senator, you pointed it out in your very first question that these cases are very dangerous. We have a concern is about victim manipulation, specifically with domestic, but especially with sexual violence. My career, I came through the Special Investigations Unit. I had spent numerous years investigating these types of crimes, and I know how suspects act. I know how suspects manipulate and try to steer victims in a certain way. So I have a concern, as does the state police, during the process of restoration, going through the justice system. Are the CJCs prepared for what could happen during this process? These cases are very dramatic. They are highly emotional. And are the CJCs prepared for what could happen during these types of processes? And again, that's really keeping the victim safety in mind. There's also the concerns of tracking. If a particular suspect and a victim decide to voluntarily provide to go through this process, and whether it's successful or not, and we know that they come out later and 2 years down the road, the victim is victimized again by the same person. How is that going to be viewed in the criminal aspect? Is this going to be their first offense, or is this going to be the second, third? The way the bill is written, it's going to be their first. And we know it is usually takes about 5 times before a victim actually calls for help. So even if they go through the restorative process, the likelihood of that being the first time of a victim going through domestic violence is very unlikely. It's going to be probably the 4th, 5th, or 6th time that they've been victimized to the point where they have to start taking steps. So I think that's very important that if it goes through the process, what does that mean for the criminal aspect if it was to happen again? And I'd also be remiss if I didn't point out, do the CJCs, and I don't know the answer to this, and I'm welcome to feedback, do they communicate with each other? If I currently live, say, down in Windsor County, and I go through the CJC process down there, and then I decide to move to Chittenden County, and I continue my bad behavior, am I still eligible to go through that CJC system in Chittenden County? As we mentioned, offenders can be very manipulative, and if they know they're not going to get a criminal record based on a domestic violence, if they move, will those CJCs communicate? Do they have the ability to track each other, know who's going through their systems, so they can make the best informed practices they go through? And the only other thing I really would say is the lack of prosecutor involvement in some of these cases, not all of them. I think there's guidance that needs to happen, albeit the training that has been developed and set forth, I think is a really good step forward in this process. And the only thing I would say substantively as far as the bill in and of itself, if you look at subsection on page 7, subsection D, or excuse me, subsection C, it says in this section in guidance created by the Community Justice Unit, the Community Justice Unit may engage in stakeholders who are relevant. I believe that may should be a shall, because I would hate to see law enforcement not be engaged in some of these, especially when it comes to the MOU practice, which I know is mentioned previously, but the MOU, I think, really sets the stage of how law
Where
enforcement.
exactly are you? I'm looking at page 7 and that's the report.
Page
section.
5, section E.
I'm sorry, why did I hear page 5?
Okay. Yeah, subsection C.
Wait, just to confirm, 5 subsection E or C, because I see the shall or the may accept referrals,
I'm looking at. the
May
bill.
engage,
may engage. Oh,
May engage.
thank you,
should be shall.
I think that should be shall.
thank you.
So really, I think we,
I'm just wondering, I take your point. If we mandate that they shall engage other stakeholders, then it seems to me we have to name who the stakeholders are. Otherwise, it's mandating a sort of nebulous.
yes, I would agree with that. And I think, as we have pointed out, that every CJC is going to be different depending on where they are. What might work in Essex County is certainly not going to work in Chittenden County.
Senator Mihalski has a question.
I just sort of a reflection on that. You know, I think if we start list, not only is every community justice center, but every case different, every case is different. And I think if we start mandating you shall engage with these people, we're not allowing for a tailored approach to each individual case in each individual community. So I'm a little wary about making a list, because we'll also inevitably leave people off the list that should be on the list. You know, I know this is criticism and this is from a different committee and my wearing my other hat, but the Act 264 community services plan program in our schools lists a bunch of stakeholders that shall be engaged.
Right.
And in some instances, they're completely irrelevant to the case. And in other instances, we're missing people that we really need there. So I'm just wary about shall engage with this list.
I think the biggest where we stand, specifically with DPS, is involvement with the MOU, and involvement with something. If it gets to the point where, say, the Vermont State Police has the ability or decides to do a direct referral to the CJC for a particular crime, I would hate to see the trooper who had spent time investigating, doing their due diligence to put forth the best case forward for the victim, to not have any say later on down in the process. I will tell you from hearing from troopers, sheriffs, officers, you name it, one of the biggest stressors right now is doing a lot of work, submitting things to the case state's attorney and never hearing back. It especially when you spend a lot of time on a case. And domestic assault cases, there's a lot of stuff that goes in on there. The Vermont State Police has developed a task force based on the seriousness of these cases. And we've developed an actual form that our troopers now follow. They are required to ask certain questions. And based on the answers to those questions, it really develops where these cases go. We are implementing the LAP form, which is the lethality assessment protocols for all of our cases. We are in the process of rolling that out statewide, which goes to show how seriously we are taking these cases. And we want to remain involved as the case goes through.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, no, I did actually, I'm sorry, I had one other question. So earlier in testimony, and I hear your concerns and everyone's concerns, and of course we want to protect victim safety, but the system as we have it now is not giving victims what they need. You know, we heard that over 7,400 people who have been victimized and supported by the network do not go through the criminal justice system. So I guess I wonder from you if this feels like it's opening an avenue for some of the people who currently are not getting their needs met to, in fact, get more of their needs met.
Oh, absolutely. I don't want to come across that I'm closing the door on this. I think this absolutely provides an opportunity for victims that would never call us. It gives them something that they can go to. And I'll refer back to my previous testimony when the bill was first written, is that we know that, especially in sexually violent cases, it is not the first time this has ever happened. Domestic violence is the same thing. It's not the first time it's ever happened. And during a process, through some sort of restorative process, things are going to come out that potentially even the victim didn't even know of. And the door should never be closed to law enforcement either. I think in the state of Vermont, we have a very robust special investigations unit. I see this potentially helping them, taking cases off their plate that that they may not have to investigate now. But I never want to take that ability from a victim to say, eventually we can do this. And law enforcement doesn't want to seem to come in as, I don't want to because I'm scared of you or anything like that. We are in the process of changing law enforcement's perception regarding these types of cases. We understand we have to change in that. We offer services that they won't be able to get through CJCs.
Yeah, I just think it's important to give victims a choice. I mean, so much of their autonomy has been taken away when they're, and I don't think it is. I think a lot of times we try to help by further taking away choice by saying you must do this rather than what do you need?
I think I would also say that, as I mentioned, I did a number of years in our special investigations unit, both as a detective and as a commander. The victim's wishes are taking 100%. I have never told my detective minus one case. If a victim doesn't want to go forward in a sexual violence case, we do not go forward. We are there to provide them with the services that they need, and that if they don't want a criminal investigation, we do not give it to them. The one time that we did was a public safety concern, and we had to, but I can't think of any other case that's come across my desk where if a victim wishes to end and just receive the services, we do not move on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate your testimony. So I've got a couple of notes from myself listening to this. I'm sorry I missed part of the testimony on the bill earlier on. But a couple of questions for me. Should we require a conviction before they can enter it? Or should we just do it normally where if the person completes the diversion program or community justice center programming, that's one issue. Second issue is the reports don't tell us anything about the success or failure of the programs. So I would like something in those reports that would reflect the numbers of people who entered into it, whether it was domestic violence or sexual assaults, sexual violence or domestic violence, and the results of those if they're available. And I'd like to consider all the amendments that have been suggested today, but also like to consider should the act be sunsetted on a certain date. So the legislature would have to come back and look at whether or not this is working or not. I don't plan to be here in 2028, so. Yes.
So I also was hoping to have some reports and referral sources in the numbers in those reports and referral sources, because one of the things I'd really like to get a sense of is are people who would never go through the criminal justice system now getting supports and services that they would get. I worry that requiring ahead of time a conviction is going to prevent people who don't go through the criminal justice system at all from coming into the system. As well as perhaps be a barrier for someone wanting to engage with this.
The only reason I brought that up was if Windsor County does it and Wyndham County does it differently, your equal justice system. So I think each county should be able to do it their way, but on the other hand, do I really want it to be different from one county to the next?
You do want it to be different?
Do I want it to be? So in other words, Wyndham County doesn't require conviction. Windsor County does. We could talk to his mother, I suppose.
Whose mother?
Ward.
Oh, yeah.
State's attorney.
I think that word can speak for himself.
But anyway, that was a joke, by the way.
I know.
I'm on, I realized I'm on YouTube. I forgot I was on
Not a great joke, but good enough.
YouTube. Senator.
Well, yeah, just a comment about the geographic differences. I mean, I don't really have a question, but you know, there is often a lot of conversation about geographic inequity. You know, I mean, for example, you know, felony DUI in Wyndham County is going to be prosecuted very differently if you're 50 feet over the line into Bennington County. And I think taking into consideration having some uniformity and consistency across the different counties is an important piece of this.
I agree. And, you know, what I keep hearing about our restorative justice system is the capacity across the different counties is so wildly different. And I worry that by trying to set that uniformity, we're going to have some counties that are like, I just can't do that, so I'm not doing anything. You know, this speaks to me to a larger question of should there be more uniformity in the CJC system across the state? Because I've heard so much about just capacity and the different ways these programs are running. You know, and I look to like our designated agency system for mental health that has been sort of, every county has one, but it's structured a little bit more at the state level. And I wonder if we really need to actually be thinking about a restructure of the restorative justice and community justice programs so that actually people across Vermont have equitable access to these services.
I think we should have a good discussion next week. Anyone who wants to comment at that time, we would welcome that. I don't know what day it'll be scheduled, but we definitely should have a spirited conversation about this thing.
Can I just, so what you were talking about, are you waiting to have those discussions and then we'll do markup?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not coming in with an amendment until you guys make those policies.
Except perhaps in the cases so that we can discuss them if you had a list of.
I think I can do the report because that seems like there's agreement. And
General, I think there's
and then
general
on
agreement
Aaron's
with
is
the
a simple
report.
one. And then the other ones are policy decisions that I think you guys haven't.
So as long as we have a list of the policy decisions that we can go over them.
Okay,
That
sure.
would be helpful.
I'll make a little list. On that
But
one.
the amendments that are around the reports, I think the general agreement that it should be more thorough.